Hi, today I'm going to cover how to make your own version of a Stream Deck that in many ways is as good or even better than the commercial version. And if you happen to have a Raspberry Pi or an old Android tablet laying around, you can do this at no cost. And if you're not a streamer, don't worry, you can use this for a lot of other functions as well, which I'll cover. So hang around. Hi, welcome to Res and Chem Tech. Now, I've only done a couple of live streams on my channel so far, but it became apparent after the first live stream that there are a lot of moving parts, especially if you have multiple cameras and you want to share your desktop or websites. You needed some way to be able to quickly switch between those scenes. Now, I knew that there were professional versions of Stream Decks out there, but I started out with this. This is a small little device developed by Dave Madison, and he shared this online, and I'll leave a link down below. But really, it's just using a Arduino Pro Micro and some Cherry push buttons, and really it's just a keyboard emulator, and it hooks up to your computer via USB. Now, while this worked great, and I used it for my second live stream, I found that just having the 8 buttons not only was a bit limiting, and to be honest, they were a little bit noisy. Also, depending on the content of my live stream, I might need to change these around, and popping these caps off and changing the labels was just going to be a little bit too limiting. So once again, I was back to looking at the professional versions of Stream Deck. Again, I just couldn't justify the cost, although they were going to give me everything that I really wanted. The ability to easily reconfigure the buttons, to have more or less an unlimited number of buttons and controls, but I just still couldn't part with that money. So I kept browsing around the internet until I came up with this. StreamPi is free open source software that runs on multiple platforms. And if you take a look at the features, again, OBS integration, Twitch, again, it has the ability to be hotkeys to launch applications or to launch websites. This really seemed like a perfect fit. And the fact that I had a Raspberry Pi laying around and a 7-inch Pi touchscreen that I've had for a couple of years and kind of been looking for use for it. So I wanted to see, could I repurpose those and really do a no-cost version that gave me something very close to the retail versions of Stream Deck. But the one thing that I found, and I'm not at all being critical because this is outstanding software and the developers have spent a lot of time and they give it away for free, but to be completely honest, their documentation does leave a little bit to be desired. Now, they do have kind of a how-to video on the main page that walks you through some of the steps, but this video is about 2.5 years old and there have been a lot of changes. They also have a documentation link down here, but that really just takes you to a shell where there isn't any real documentation. So I decided that I would take a shot at doing a step-by-step guide on how to set this up on a Raspberry Pi using Windows 10 and OBS Studio. And before we begin, just so you know, I actually am using this device during this recording. So it just goes to show you that there's a lot of flexibility and this doesn't have to be used just for streaming. So even though I'm going to be covering the install of the client on a Raspberry Pi, remember you aren't limited to using the Raspberry Pi as a client. Recent releases of the software have added a lot of other platforms, including Android, which means you can install this on a tablet or even a phone, and Mac OS has been added as well. So again, just substitute your particular device for the client install if you're not using a Raspberry Pi. So I'm going to start this from the very beginning. Even if you've never used a Raspberry Pi before, I'm going to walk through the entire process of setting up the Raspberry Pi, connecting it to the 7-inch display, how to set up the client side and the server side of StreamPi, how to connect that to OBS, and then how to interact and create your shortcuts on the interface. Now, if you've already done a lot of this before, you may not want to sit through all that, so I will leave links here along the video timeline and down in the video description so you can jump straight to the part that might interest you. So real quickly, here are the parts you're going to need. I will leave links to all these down in the video description. And I'm using a Raspberry Pi 3B Plus. Yes, you can use a Raspberry Pi 4. Just be aware that currently the Raspberry Pis are very hard to get a hold of due to chip shortages. So you may have to look around or wait a bit until you can get a hold of a Raspberry Pi. But otherwise, you're just going to need a micro SD card, at least 8 gig. I recommend a 16 or preferably a 32. And this is the Raspberry Pi touchscreen that I use. There are other brands or models of this out there. It doesn't have to be this particular one. and a power supply. And in this case, even though you only need a 2.5 amp 5 volt for the Raspberry Pi, we need a 3 amp 5 volt power supply because we're also going to be powering the display off the same power supply. So that's all you need for the parts. Again, check down in the video description for links. Okay, if you've never set up a Raspberry Pi before, the first thing you want to do is go to the Raspberry Pi website, raspberrypi.com, links down below, and on this page, go to Software. The first thing you're going to want to do is install this Raspberry Pi Imager onto your machine. This is going to make it very easy to put the Raspberry Pi software onto your micro SD card. So just download that for your particular operating system and install that. Then put your micro SD card into the reader on your PC or laptop or whatever machine you're using and launch the Imager. So after you launch the Imager, the first thing you need to do is you need to choose the operating system or the OS. When this screen comes up, make sure you're selecting this very first option, the Raspberry Pi OS 32-bit. That comes with the full desktop. I generally install the light version, which is what I'm going to pick here, but I actually had to go back and start over because some of the graphical libraries are needed for the StreamPi application, and that doesn't work with just the light version. So make sure you're choosing the full version of the Raspberry Pi OS 32-bit. Next, you need to select the micro SD card that you have connected to your computer, then click the little gear icon. First, go ahead and give your Raspberry Pi a meaningful name on your network so you can keep it apart from other Raspberry Pis. I like to enable remote access so I can configure this thing without a keyboard or a mouse. And go ahead and enter in a password for the default Pi user. Check the Wi-Fi box, enter in your Wi-Fi credentials, and then go ahead and select your country and set your time zone. And that's pretty much should be all that you need at this point. So go ahead and click the Save button, then click the Write button. Confirm that you selected the right device because it will overwrite all of the data on the device, and sit back and wait for the Raspberry Pi OS to be installed. And once the installation is complete, you can eject the SD card and remove it from your computer and insert it into the Raspberry Pi. Now at this point, if you're not using the touchscreen, you're going to need to either get the IP address so you can remotely connect to your Raspberry Pi, or you're going to need to temporarily hook up a display and a keyboard. Even if you're using the touchscreen, you may want to temporarily hook up a USB keyboard. It's just going to make the install of the client a little bit easier. Now, the Pi touchscreen comes with instructions on how to set it all up. It's pretty simple. So I'm really just going to show inserting the Raspberry Pi here. Take our Raspberry Pi, it fits nicely into this slot on the back. And then what we need to do is gently lift the tabs on the video connection and gently insert the ribbon cable into that, and then press the tabs back down to lock it in place. Now all we have to do is take the back cover and snap it into place, and that holds the Raspberry Pi firmly in place while allowing you access to all of the ports. Then we take the split power connector, connect one side of that to the Raspberry Pi itself and the other one to the display, and then we plug that into our 5-volt power supply and we're ready to power it up. Once again, remember that you do need at least a 3 amp 5-volt power supply. If the screen doesn't come on or you get a low warning on the display, again, double check, make sure you have at least a 3 amp 5-volt power supply. First time it boots up, it's going to resize the file system and it's going to reboot a second time. But if all goes according to plan and everything boots up, it should bring you right into the Raspberry Pi desktop. So before we set up the client, either on the Raspberry Pi or another device, we do need to get the server side set up. Now, StreamPi comes out of the box with the ability to go ahead and control your local PC and launch applications. But if you are going to use this with OBS Studio, you do need to install a utility called OBS Websockets. It's not hard, a couple clicks of the button, but it is a required step. As I mentioned, this step is very easy. You just need to go to the GitHub repo for the WebSockets. I'll leave a link down in the video description. Go to the latest release, select the platform for the machine that you're installing this on, download it, and once the download completes, you simply just launch the application. And it works just like any other Windows installer. Accept the terms, accept the defaults, and go ahead and click install. Now, I did get a warning when I did this that OBS Studio was currently running. which of course I was using to record this. I thought I'd be smart and try to go ahead and say, don't stop it. That didn't work. It kicked off an error message, so I actually had to stop OBS Studio and finish the install and restart OBS Studio. But once it's installed, you don't have to do anything else. There is no setup or configuration of this. It's just used by the StreamPi server to connect to OBS. Okay, now we're ready to install the StreamPi server. And like the OBS Websocket, you want to install this server software on the PC that you're aiming to control or the one where you have OBS installed. Downloading the server is just as easy as downloading any other Windows application. We're going to go to the StreamPi main site. Again, links down below. We're going to get the latest server, and then that's going to take us right to the GitHub repo. We're simply going to select the server for our particular platform. In my case, it's Windows. Let that download, and once it's done downloading, just go ahead and launch it. Then, like any other Windows application, agree to the terms, check next, 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 and wait for the installation to complete. Now the server should launch automatically, but if it doesn't, just launch the icon for StreamPi server. Once again, agree to yet another license agreement. And then at this point, we want to give our server a name. That would just be so you could distinguish it if you happen to be running multiple servers, if you use more than one machine, and enter in a port. By default, the port is 6504, but you can change that. And at this point, the server is running and it's waiting for a connection from a client. Okay, now we're finally ready to set up the client. I'm going to be showing setting up the client on that Raspberry Pi, but if you're using a different device, like a phone or a tablet, just download the files for your particular device from the same location, install those, and go ahead and skip forward into the video to the section on setting up the client. Okay, to install the client, we're just going to go back to the StreamPi main web page, but this time we're going to select Client Releases. Again, that's going to take us to GitHub. Now, if you're using a Raspberry Pi, you may want to connect an external keyboard or connect remotely, because to install this on a Raspberry Pi, we're actually just going to execute a command from the command prompt. So it's very easy just to copy and paste that and go ahead and execute the command and let that run. Once it does complete installing, it is going to prompt you to reboot the Raspberry Pi. When it reboots, the desktop should come up and you should now see a new icon on the desktop for the StreamPi client. And the first time you launch the client, there'll be yet another license agreement to agree to. So go ahead and agree to that. And then we want to give this client a unique name on our network. Now, it is possible to have multiple clients and multiple servers operating on the same network. But you do not need to identify the client and then tell this client which server IP address and which server port that you want it to connect to. And so that is the machine that it's going to control, normally where OBS would be located. Once you've entered that information in, just go ahead and confirm it. And once you do that, you'll see that it shows up with a single button. But the difference is it is now available on the server side. If you drop that down, we'll see the client, but we don't have a profile. Okay, I've switched both the server and the client over to dark mode to make things a little bit more viewable here. But as I was saying, the first time you set up and connect to a client, it will not have a profile. So you have to define at least one default profile. To do that, it's easy enough. On the server side, we're going to go to the gear icon, clients, there's our client, and we add a new profile. I've already got a couple of them defined here, so I'm going to use this test. And the first thing we're going to do is define the number of rows and columns we want on our display. Save that, and you'll see it's immediately reflected on the client. When I save this here, and I close and go back and I re-choose my client, now I have a profile. I'll just select that, and you can see that's immediately reflected there as well. Let's go ahead and add our first button to this. And for that, I'm just going to basically just add a button to select a scene in OBS. So I'm just going to simply drop that in there. And I come down here to the settings. I can give it a name to display up here, but I'm actually going to hide that because I'm going to opt to show an icon here instead. I have a number of them already defined here, so I'm just going to select the icon. This is going to be to display camera 1. And then the only other thing we have to do is we have to put in the scene name. Now this needs to match exactly what you have defined in OBS. Mine happens to be called Camera 1. So when I save that, you'll see not only does it change there, it also changes on our client. And that actually is active immediately. If I go ahead and tap this button, there you're going to see there's Camera 1. And if you do opt to set up multiple profiles, say maybe you have one set for streaming, another profile for recording, and a third profile for something like work, or you might even have multiple users and each with their own profile. It's very easy to switch between them. We simply go to the gear icon, find our profile. I'm going to go back to my default profile, so we just tap that, and then I close, and now I've switched over to a different profile. If I need to edit that, I just come back over to the server side and select the other profile. So now it's very easy for me to jump from one camera over here and to return right back to where I was with the simple touch of a button. So I'll briefly cover a few other features here without getting into a whole lot of detail. We've already saw all the various OBS commands that you can use here. Obviously, I can select any scene. I can set volume. Some of these, like the record and the stream, are actually toggles, so I can toggle things off and on. The only important thing to remember here is using that WebSocket. If you define a scene or a source or something like that here, down here in the line where you set that up, you just have to make sure this exactly matches what you have defined in OBS. But again, you aren't limited to just OBS. We go up here and look at StreamPy. We say we can create a folder. I actually have one here. It's a little hard to see down here, but it's a folder of audio and sounds. So I can tap that and it will actually take me to a full new screen where I can have my soundboard set up. And then I can return back to the same menu. So you aren't necessarily limited to the number of buttons that are on one screen. Again, if we take a look at Twitter, you can actually send out a tweet. Whatever tweet that you want to send there. There are a number of essentials. This is kind of locally on the machine. I can launch a website. I can run commands or executables. I can set up hotkeys. I can open a file, play audio clips. And then again, if you're a Twitch user, there are all kind of commands here that you can use as Twitch as well. And the author claims that they are going to continue to work and add additional APIs to additional services down the road. So one of the other things I have heard that people like about the retail version is the fact that it has physical buttons, and it's not as easy to inadvertently hit the wrong button and bring up a camera when you don't want to. So the one thing that I did was I actually just 3D printed an overlay that simply snaps on top here of my display, and that helps make sure I've got a little feedback and that I don't inadvertently hit the wrong button when I don't intend to. So again, that is completely optional. Just something I printed up that you could add to this to help from fat fingering the wrong button. So what are my conclusions? Is this as full featured as the retail version? Not yet, but it sure has an awful lot of the same features. And the fact that I was able to build this at no cost based on parts I already had around the house, and if you happen to have maybe a spare Android tablet or laptop, something along those lines, you can also do this at no cost, as opposed to spending around $250 for a retail version of around the same size. And while I haven't used it a lot yet, I'm already finding it very handy to be able to very easily switch from one camera to another camera and back again without having to mess around with any of the on-screen controls. It's even possible for me to very easily just play a background sound. And I haven't even attempted to try to use this for things like editing or my day-to-day job. But again, for the no cost versus $250, again, being a cheapskate, this was a good solution for me. Well, that's going to do it for this video. If you found anything in this video that you liked or found helpful, please hit that like button. That lets both me and YouTube know you'd like to see more videos like this. And if you'd like to see more of my videos, hit that subscribe button and ding that little bell icon to be notified when I release new videos. As always, I would like to say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon.